the nation's worst economic crises. So again, Section 3, the Ford and Carter years.
By many is the most important speech of President Carter's term. A look back now as 830 WCCO's year-end special continues.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the idea which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. We've always believed in something called progress. We've always had a faith that the days of our children would be better than our own. Our people are losing that faith. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years. We were taught that our armies were always invincible and our causes were always just, only to suffer the agony of Vietnam. We respected the presidency as a place of honor until the shock of Watergate. We've got to stop crying and start sweating. Stop talking and start walking. Working together with our common faith, we cannot fail.
So I forgot to introduce it, but that to me is my favorite speech in American history. It's Jimmy Carter's famous Melee speech. He says, for the first time in American history, people think that the next 5 years are going to be worse than the previous 5 years. And then he goes on to say, and what can we do about it? It's time for us to stop crying and to start sweating, to stop trying and to start walking. I think about that a lot. And I think about the end message, to come together, to build a better world together. Because we have to deal with the agony of Vietnam and the shame of Watergate. And we have to think about those things because they're a part of who we are. And then we have to move forward. And so in September of 1974, the new president, Gerald Ford, as one of his first official acts in office, pardoned Richard Nixon, making the claim that we had to move past Watergate. Most people saw through this as a hollow action. Ford's not going to win election for a number of reasons, perhaps most of which for his pardoning of Richard Nixon. But he has the same domestic and foreign problems that Richard Nixon had, most notably stagflation, rising unemployment coupled with rising inflation. And what can be done about this? Well, part of the rising inflation was due to the tripling of gas prices in the 1970s. And when the price of fuel goes up, the price of everything else goes up, because if it costs more to get it on the trucks and to put it in the stores, then it costs more for the consumer to buy it off the shelf. And so Ford tried to, as he called it, to whip inflation. His goal was to reduce consumption of domestic oil by encouraging Americans to drive less, or to carpool, or to ride bikes, or to in any way to use less oil. But it doesn't work that way. You can't just ask Americans to drive less. It doesn't work. He also tried to cut government spending, reducing the budget. Also pushed for the Fed to use higher interest rates to restrict the amount of borrowing. This is called the tight money policy. In fact, it triggered a recession. It became more difficult for people to access loans for cars, for homes, for consumer goods. And so as a result, it triggered a recession. And so not only was he up against the American people, who saw him as dishonest, but he was also against a Congress that was predominantly Democrat, and who had a different economic agenda than he did. Now, perhaps Ford's greatest success were some of his foreign policy achievements, most notably the continuing of the legacy that Richard Nixon began in the opening of relations with China and the Soviet Union. In fact, Ford brokered and signed the Helsinki Accords, an agreement of cooperation between Eastern and Western Europe. Not an end of the Cold War, but a beginning of an end to the Cold War. But also during Ford's presidency, peace talks in Vietnam were beginning to fail. Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1972, revoking the president's power to wage war in Vietnam. Ceasefire was agreed to in 1973. Within 2 years, South Vietnam had surrendered to North Vietnam, and now Vietnam is a communist nation. So after all those years of investment, after those tens of thousands of American lives, it was a defeat. Meanwhile, a U.S. merchant ship was off the coast of Cambodia, which, if you'll remember, Cambodia also turned to a communist dictatorship under the Khmer Rouge regime, under the leader of the third largest mass murderer in world history. And this merchant ship was captured by pirates. I don't know if you've seen the movie Captain Phillips starring Tom Hanks, but it tells a really neat story, a true story of a U.S. merchant ship that was captured by Somali pirates about 5 or 6 years ago. And the United States Navy SEALs simultaneously killed all of the pirates, rescuing the captain and all of the crew members on board without the loss of a single life. I mean, it's one of the most incredible acts in the history of the Navy SEALs. All 4 pirates that remained were killed at the same time. But that was not the case at the Mayagüez. Gerald Ford ordered a big military response, sent in the U.S. Marines. 41 Marines died to save this merchant ship. It was definitely not a success.
At first, public opinion polls put Mr. Ford's popularity higher than any American leader since Franklin Roosevelt. But the ratings took a new plunge when the new president announced a full pardon for Richard Nixon. In the following months, President Ford moved out into the world. In November, he became the first American president in office to visit Japan. From Japan, he went to his first summit meeting with Russian leaders at Vladivostok and signed an agreement with Mr. Brezhnev limiting offensive nuclear weapons for the next 10 years. This deal helped strengthen a détente increasingly under strain, especially in the Middle East.
So, it should be no surprise that Gerald Ford was not reelected. In 1976, President Jimmy Carter promised to restore integrity to the presidency In fact, he is now the longest living U.S. president in American history. And he's still building houses for Habitat for Humanity. I mean, as you're about to see, he may not have had the most successful presidency, but in my personal opinion, he's had the most successful post-presidential career of any American president. And he's one of my heroes. He defeated Ford by a very close margin. Even though, Ford's legacy of pardoning Nixon and his domestic failures and so forth. But when Carter came to office, this peanut farmer from central Georgia, who grew up near the Chattooga River, who actually has one of the first canoe descents of the rapids on the Chattooga River. He's a down-to-earth person. And you're about to hear him speak. He's got a thick Southern accent, which I feel like the White House needs a little more of. And he has a real down-to-earth style. He would hold regular fireside chats, televised broadcasts where he would talk with the American people. He was known for not making deals with Congress or sticking to his morals, which probably cost him a lot of political clout, which is probably why he didn't get a lot done. Because, in fact, his refusal to compromise on his values actually led both parties to turn against him and work against him on a lot of different things. So, first off, Jimmy Carter offered a number of energy proposals, trying, again, like Ford, to lessen our dependence on foreign oil, but also to reduce our consumption of foreign oil. And perhaps the most successful initiative in the 1970s to this end was the passage of the National Energy Act, which encourages conservation of U.S. energy sources, which promotes conservation, also to cut foreign oil dependence. But the price of oil still went up. And by the end of the 1970s, gas was 3 times what it had been at the beginning of the 1970s. Guys, that would be like, by 2020, us paying $9 a gallon for gas. No, right? I'd just be riding my bike to work. Couldn't afford it. Because the thing you have to realize is, and I'm translating to modern dollars. From 1970 to 1980, gas went from $3 to $9. But American incomes did not change. If anything, they went down. And so can you imagine? What would we do? Most of us can't just feasibly ride bikes to work or school. Okay, so part of this was due to violence in the Middle East. Part of this was due to the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Nothing seemed to work, and it was at that time when Carter gave that speech that I showed you at the beginning. And by 1980, the standard of living had dropped. People were beginning to lose confidence. And so I want to ask the question, why? Why is the economy getting worse with all of this technology? With all of these breakthroughs and global cooperation, why are things getting worse? Well, I have 2 basic answers for you. Number 1 is automation. And that's not changing. Okay, so in the next 10 years, cars will drive themselves. Yay, I can take a nap on the way to work. Woo, I'm excited. I want to buy one of the first self-driving cars. I probably can't afford it, but I'll buy one later at least. But what does that mean? Hey, that's great for me. I can take a nap on the way to work. I mean, seriously, that's like a long-term goal. But what does that mean? The more important thing is, what does that mean? I used to drive a school bus. Used to drive for Headwaters Outfitters. I've driven big trucks and cars, and I've driven professionally, and I can tell you, like, driving is honest work. It's skilled work. It carries a lot of liability to it. And there's a bit of pride in knowing that you can operate heavy machinery. But you know what? that entire career field is going away. In 10 years, it won't matter if you can drive a big truck because you won't be needed. And what if that's your only skill set? What if that's what you've done as your career, is you've driven a big truck? Well, you might as well change your name to the Jodes because you're out of work. You know how many drivers we have in this country? I sure don't, because we got a lot of drivers in this country. I mean, you get on the highway. I know some of you guys are just now driving the interstate for the first time. Semi-trucks are one of the most common vehicles that you see. Every one of those semi-trucks is somebody making a living, providing for their family. Every one of those trucks that you will see is a family that will be out of work in 10 years. And what's that going to mean? Okay, so let's rewind a little bit. 1950s. What are some jobs we don't need anymore by the 1950s? Well, we don't need cotton pickers. Well, there goes the Jodes, right? We just don't. There's a machine that does that. We don't need near as many migrant farmers. We don't need a lot of the unskilled labor that we did in the early 20th century. Why? Because robots do those things. But also what? Why are most of the things that we buy made somewhere else? Cheaper. It's cheaper. Why? Well, in China, for example, they have very few environmental laws. It's not safe to breathe the air in Beijing. You stay inside, you don't go outside. But as a result, it's cheaper to make things there. People die earlier in Beijing, but as a result, it's cheaper to make things there. Okay. Foreign competition, automation, reduce the manufacturing jobs in this country. And they're disappearing and they're continuing to disappear. So what does that mean? Well, there's still jobs. I mean, your families hopefully have jobs post-1950. They've just had to think differently. And that's what's going to happen to these drivers. But it's going to take some economic adjustment. The self-driving car will be heralded as a great technological marvel, followed by a recession. Mark my words. It will be the technological marvel of your coming of age, followed by a recession, which will eventually transition toward progress. But it's going to take some time for those drivers to find different lines of work. Okay, so President Carter is my hero in a number of ways. One of these is that he hired more African Americans and women than any previous president. He was absolutely a compassionate civil rights advocate. But because of his lack of tenacity, because of his moral compass perhaps even, he got very few laws passed. In fact, the Supreme Court struck down many of the useful parts of affirmative action in the Back versus UC Berkeley regents. And so, many of the effective parts of affirmative action were underdone at that point. Now, Jimmy Carter's passion was human rights, even to a fault. I mean, this is just what he believed in, what he felt, and it hurt his domestic agendas to some degree, because in many cases he would cut off aid to countries that he felt were mistreating their own people. And he would even dampen relations with countries that he felt that mistreated their own citizens, because he believed that all people had basic human rights. Now, in 1977, the people of Panama protested that the United States had been exploiting their region for close to 80 years. The Panama Canal was dug, if I remember correctly, in 1901. And as a result, it gave the United States and other Western countries the greatest shortcut to the Pacific Ocean that it could possibly be. And the people of Panama benefited very little from this. And so an agreement was made, and it was followed through on December 31st of 1999 The Panama Canal now belongs to the people of Panama.
Mr. Sakharov, you said that the United States would use its good offices to seek the release of prisoners of conscience. And you said that you wanted to continue to shape a world responsible to human aspirations. As you know, there are human rights problems in many other countries. And some of them, like Iran or the Philippines, we support with arms or we support with American aid. These are countries where many people believe we have more leverage than we might have in the Soviet Union. What, if anything, do you plan to try to do to help victims of political repression in these countries?
I think without my trying to take credit for it, there has been a substantial move toward concern about human rights throughout the world. I think this has taken place in probably a dozen or more different countries. There's an arousing interest in the position that our own government here in our free country does take. Obviously, there are deprivations of human rights even more brutal than the ones on which we've commented up to now. In Uganda, the actions there have disgusted the entire civilized world. And as you know, we have no diplomatic relationships with Uganda. But here is an instance where both Ambassador Andrew Young and I have expressed great concern about what is there. The British are now considering asking the United Nations to go into Uganda to assess the horrible murders that apparently are taking place in that country, the persecution of those who have aroused the ire of Mr. Amin. I've expressed my concern about imprisoned political prisoners in South Korea, in Cuba, in many countries, in several countries rather, in South America, and I'll continue to do so. I have never had an inclination to single out the Soviet Union as the only place where human rights are being abridged. We have, I think, a responsibility and a legal right to express our disapproval of violations of human rights. The Helsinki Agreement, so-called Basket 3 provision, ensures that some of these human rights should be preserved. We are a signatory of the Helsinki Agreement. We are ourselves culpable in some ways for not giving people adequate right to move around our country, for restricting unnecessarily, in my opinion, visitation to this country by those who disagree with us politically. So I think that we all ought to take a position in our own country and among our friends and allies, among our potential adversaries, that human rights is something on which we should bear a major responsibility for leadership. And I have made it clear to the Soviet Union and to others in the Eastern European community that I'm not trying to launch a unilateral criticism of them, that I'm trying to set a standard in our own country and make my concerns expressed throughout the world, not single out against any particular country.
And so you can see that he has a passion for human rights. But you can also see as president that's a very complicated and sensitive matter. Because when you're dealing with sovereign nations, you're limited in what you can do. I mean, like he acknowledged, the people of Uganda in the 1970s were being treated awfully by their government. And they were starving people. And it's difficult for a man like that who's passionate and helping people to sit and watch innocent women and children suffer as a result of a government that treats its people badly. In fact, his insistence on civil rights and human rights strained relations, also with countries like the USSR, who also treated its citizens badly at the time. In fact, that caused a delay in the strategic arm limitation talks, which were finally signed in June of 1979. But also in that same year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which would prove to be their Vietnam. And we won't go into that in this course. Now, in regards to foreign policy, Jimmy Carter did have one significant accomplishment. In 1978, he hosted peace talks between the leader of Egypt and the leader of Israel. They were called the Camp David Accords. The agreement reached was that Israel would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, and in return Egypt would recognize Israel's right to exist, because from 1948 until 1978, Egypt had vowed to destroy the nation of Israel. And Jimmy Carter saw at least a brokering of a peace between the two nations. Granted, things are still tense there. Now in Iran, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini led a popular uprising, also in the late 1970s. And Iran went from a fascist dictatorship to an Islamic state. The irony here is that Jimmy Carter, with his insistence on human rights, supported the fascist dictatorship because he was preventing the spread of communism.
February the 1st, 1979. Not only an historic day in the history of Iran, but also one that was to have profound effects on world politics for years to come. On that day, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to his homeland after 14 years in exile. The Shah of Iran had fled the country just a fortnight earlier. His leftover government was now denounced as illegal by the Ayatollah's supporters, who wanted their religious leader to take over the reins and turn the country into an Islamic state. Simon Dring was the BBC reporter at the airport when Khomeini arrived to his tumultuous welcome.
Inside the terminal, the chaos became almost uncontrollable. More than 1,000 church leaders had gathered to meet him, not that they saw very much. As everybody fought to get close, the man himself stood calmly in the shadows, waiting for the songs of welcome and the prayers to finish, before taking his turn to speak. His first words were, as expected, forceful and to the point. This is the first step in the final defeat of 50 years of criminal rule. We must cut off the hands of the foreigners who are responsible for our ills and cast out all the roots of the old regime. And with that, he left to face his people.
And those people, in a frenzy of excitement, turned out in their hundreds of thousands to give the Ayatollah's motorcade a rapturous welcome as it progressed through the streets of the capital. Within days of this victorious return, Khomeini announced that democracy had no place in Iran. An Islamic republic was established. Supporters of the Shah were executed, and the Ayatollah himself was made the absolute ruler. The ramifications of this February day rumbled on for years, through the Middle East to Europe, and terrorism, to Washington, and the Iran Gate scandal, which threatened the American administration itself.
In fact, shortly after the takeover of the Islamic cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, Jimmy Carter allowed for the Shah of Iran, the former dictator of Iran, to escape to the United States. He had been dictator of Iran for almost 50 years, and yet he escaped to the United States with the help of President Carter, because we had close ties. He was helping us stop the spread of communism. It goes back to the Eisenhower Doctrine. In response, the people of Iran stormed the U.S. Embassy there, took 52 American hostages, and held them hostage for over a year. Negotiations weren't working, and these people were not set free until the Reagan administration.
This is an ABC News special. The Iran crisis. America held hostage. Day 58.
No one will easily forget how the 80s began. American hostages in Iran gave birth to a national mania and to a television program that reminded us nightly of our plight. America held hostage. Americans were shocked and angered. How could a third world country headed by a religious fanatic bring a superpower to its knees? Why couldn't we just get them out? We found that it was a very complicated affair, and that terrorism has many faces. On November 4th, 1979, student radicals seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking over 60 Americans hostage. Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran's fundamentalist Muslim leader, refuses to release the Americans. Like most momentous events, the hostage crisis has its roots in history. Our involvement began with this man, the Shah of Iran, when the CIA helped stage a coup d'etat and place Mohammad Reza Pahlavi on the throne. For 37 years, the Shah kept Iran staunchly in the Western political orbit and relentlessly modernized his oil-rich country. Internal dissent was quelled in the streets and in the torture chambers by Savak, the Shah's secret police. Happy to have an anti-communist policeman in the vital oil center of the Persian Gulf, successive U.S. governments overlooked Iran's growing internal dissent.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world.
But that was changing fast. By late 1978, Iranians were no longer tolerating the Shah's excesses. Demonstrators were shot in the streets. More and more protesters waved pictures of the Shah's most powerful enemy. In France, Khomeini was a virtual government in exile, fueling the religious revolution at home.
Oh, my people, do not hesitate. You have the power. Do not be afraid of these superpowers.
Realizing that he had lost his grip on his country, the Shah and his family fled. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini returned to a tumultuous, emotional welcome.